In the week of hurricanes in Florida, we need to ask an uncomfortable question. Has federal flood insurance policy made the damage more extensive? The East Coast port worker strike is temporarily settled, but the effort to kill port automation is still on the table. Does automation really kill jobs? California and Minnesota are outlawing AI deepfakes deemed political. Is this a victory against hate and discrimination? And what about California's new law banning legacy admission at even private colleges? Let's talk about all this. Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. And welcome to Independent Outlook, where we try to offer an independent take on the issues of the day. As always, I am joined by my perennial conversation partner, Williamson Evers, polymath of liberty and director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Great to have you, Bill.
Good to be here, Graham.
So let's talk about some of the background context of the hurricane damage. I mean, the hurricanes have been incredible. Helene, 119 people died. Milton, not final count that I've seen yet, but, several dozen. The damage is pretty incredible, stretching over multiple states. And, you wonder why so many people live in these extremely exposed areas. And I saw an article that you pointed out to me, Bill, examining the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a federally subsidized insurance program for people who live in risky areas. Can you say anything about that, Bill?
Well, if you make it less expensive to do things, people will do them if it's the kind of thing they want to do. So if you say, well, would you like to live in an area with a beautiful climate and near the beach and sunshine in the wintertime? And you say, there are a few drawbacks, but we'll pay you to make those drawbacks go away. Lots of people will do it. And so they have. And it's, it makes for opportunities. It creates hazard. It's subsidizing hazardous behavior.
Right.
And
so you get
you're
more
going
of
to get more of it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, the other thing that we see in the wake of the hurricane is prices go up because in this local situations and context of the post-disaster, there are things that the quantity is not there, the supplies are not there, the people have a lot of things they could be doing, and they have to figure out how to allocate what they do and what they have to its highest valued use. And so if you clamp down on prices, you're just going to distort things and create long lines and not attract supplies to areas that need them.
Yeah, when prices for emergency supplies go up, then emergency supplies from other locations pour in to take advantage of the higher prices.
Right, and people will pour in too.
Yeah, that's true too.
And, it's you're cutting off your nose to spite your face kind of thing to say, well, we need lots of people here, and some of them need to be quite technical and so forth. And there's lots of these jobs, but you can't pay anymore to reflect the intensity of needs and what preferences are. And so it will just distort it. And that's exactly what we're seeing. I mean, Florida is one of the best governed states in the United States, and they've prepared a lot. Issue of the whole thing related to federal flood insurance and money to rebuild your house and all sorts of things goes back, the controversy over it goes back to Grover Cleveland's presidency. So he was a president in the late 19th century. And he was pretty much a laissez-faire classical liberal. We wanted to get it detailed, I'm sure. We can find plenty of fault with him. In fact, Lysander Spooner wrote a whole long letter to him about how wrong he was. But anyway.
But you're saying he was right on one thing, huh?
Well, he was right on many things. But So one thing he said was there was a drought in Texas, and people wanted Congress to allocate money for seed to replace the seed shortages and things like that in Texas, so that Texas could recover its crops and things like that. And so he wrote a veto, and he said, look, if the United States government didn't cause the problem or wasn't in some intimate way, federal government was connected to the creation, or the people that are affected are like federal troops or federal civil servants or something like that, it's not really the federal government's job. It might be the local government's job, but if any of them step in too much, they'll actually hamper civic virtues, private virtues, community virtues of self-help, of aiding each other, of the market stepping in and adjusting to the situation. He actually wrote a very intelligent thing about it. And as we look at everybody clamoring for how much more money they want from the taxpayer, it would be kind of charming to see some people move back over Cleveland direction.
What's fascinating about the situation in Florida is that in both matters, we're talking about prices. And so with regard to emergency supplies and whatnot, prices are going to go up because there's going to be a shortage, and then they'll go back down eventually. By arguing, as I think you are doing, that it would be a mistake for, say, the Florida government to step in and clamp on price controls for emergency goods, by arguing that, you're not saying that it would be bad for individuals to be generous and give stuff away.
In fact, there's a philosopher, Matt Zawolinsky, who has actually written on this whole issue. And he says, well, look, in general, you want the price to reflect supply and demand, so prices are going to go up when there's increased demand or less of the supply. But, he says, let's say you're a mom and pop grocery store or you're a local restaurant, and you have regular customers that are recognizable to you and so forth. Well, it makes sense, both just on a kind of friend-to-friend basis or a goodwill basis, to not, when you can, to not charge this higher price that the situation would normally call for. And so it's a kind of price adjustment that you can make that is consistent with the morality of a decent person.
Right. It's just virtue and generosity and caring about your neighbors.
Generosity. And so there's, of course, nothing wrong with that.
In fact, everything right.
Exactly. But at the same time, in general, it makes sense for the price to reflect this supply.
And there's one big difference between the two sides of this coin. We're talking about persons exercising generosity and care for their neighbors on the one hand, or the threat or the reality in some cases of the government coercively forcing prices to be kept low. That's a whole different ballgame than voluntary charity. And it has horribly distorting effects.
It does.
And so that's what we were talking about at the beginning of this little section on the hurricanes, because that's precisely what the federal involvement in the flood insurance policy does. The government steps in with its coercive, power and its tax power, and it subsidizes the insurance rates because they're responding to public demand to say, oh, it's so mean, for insurance policies to go up in price. So the government should step in and make them go down in price. Just like
there are huge headlines in the New York Times about crisis, insurance rates are going to go up. On the other hand, economist Mario Rizzo put on Facebook a kind of very well pithy comment saying, the only way we're going to fix this problem of all these buildings, commercial buildings, residences being smashed is if people have to pay the full market rate of insurance. But, he said, right now, it's politically unpalatable to the politicians. They want to have giveaways, they want to have handouts, and this is what they're doing. They're encouraging people to do things that are not sensible.
I was kind of stunned to read that in 2018, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, had admitted in one of its analysis papers that these flood insurance subsidies create perverse incentives, quote, encouraging lower income households eligible for assistance to purchase properties in very risky areas.
Yeah.
And apparently that resulted in 13 million homeowners now live in special flood hazard areas because of the incentives, which is remarkable.
Yeah, it's like saying, well, here's a swimming pool. We want you to live in it, but here's $1 million, so get used to it.
Right. Now, it goes back to what you said about Grover Cleveland a few minutes ago, though.
Yeah.
Apparently, his principle, which makes a lot of sense to me, is that unless the government is implicated or the cause of something, it should not be the solution to something. However, in the current situation, if in fact utterly foolish government policies like flood insurance subsidies have been in place,
I don't buy the way you're stating it.
You see where I'm going.
Yeah, but I don't agree. Let's say they set up a military base in Florida and they have military housing around it, and they get hit with a hurricane or flooding or just terrible windstorm, whatever, tornadoes. Seen a lot of those lately. It makes sense. It's a federal thing, but I think otherwise, you can't. That's like saying, oh, they build highways to get to the housing, and so everybody gets treats because we built highways, and that made it easier to go in there. I'm just not going for that.
Got it. I was trying to offer some kind of incremental solution, but hey,
you're
I'm a softie.
That's right. You're a softie.
Let's change the subject. Although
it's okay to be a softie in private life, to the
exactly, which we were saying before.
To the extent it's warranted and you can afford it and so forth.
Right. Yeah. Well, before we turn to the topic, we're just we're obviously thinking and praying for people in North Carolina and Florida and elsewhere who are struggling.
I have family in North Dakota. They're in the
North
central
Carolina
part, not whatever I said. I meant North Carolina.
Yes. Yeah.
And they have to, they work in areas that have to do with the environment and emergencies and things like that. So they're not in the actual area of this devastation, but they're on top of it.
So changing the subject, sort of, we're still on economic dynamics, I suppose, but recently they settled the port strike, which had shut down all 36 East and Gulf Coast ports.
Right.
Because the longshoremen had been, striking. They wanted more money, so they wanted like 77% raise, and then the port owners, they wanted less than that.
We on the staff of Independent Institute are looking for a 77%.
There you go. Right, please enact 77%. Yeah. So they wanted...
I look at it slightly differently. Donors, please give us 77%.
There you go.
Anyway, so people in the West Coast might not realize this, but there's two different longshoremen's unions. So the West Coast one is one that was headed, when I was growing up, by Harry Bridges, who was communist. He was a Republican and a communist, but that's a very complicated story. And the West Coast ports are pretty automated right now. In fact, the head of the East Coast Longshoremen, International Longshoremen's Association, at a recent convention, showed a video of Los Angeles port with all the mechanical devices that are being used. He said, and the East Coast, it's going to be over my dead body that we do this automation. Now, of course, it's tremendously higher costs for the people that are transporting things, the people that, are in the retail business of selling it to us, and for the consumers to have to pay, before containers, they had to take each little item practically separately and then move them to something that was going to transport them the next stage. We now have containers. That's a great deal of efficiency that's improved. He isn't asking to get rid of that. It's the old weird job creating thing,
Right,
So,
exactly. Apparently there were,
because as Milton Friedman might say, he's talking in China to people about dam building and equipment and so forth. He said, well, yeah, you could create more jobs by, instead of bulldozers, having people use trowels to
That is true. That is
the
true.
earth.
Well,
So
the picketers apparently were holding signs up saying automation hurts families and kills jobs.
well, I can remember that there used to be a thing called the Fund for the Republic, and it had a thing called the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions.
Oh, I remember that one.
Santa Barbara,
Yeah.
Montecito area, and they put out all sorts of stuff about third revolution or whatever. Automation was just this was like in the 60s,
Right.
okay? So they were saying the end of the world is coming, automation is coming. And I think most sensible people, particularly economists, said, well, this is just another labor-saving device. And, there will be adjustments because you'll have to have some people be building this equipment, some people maintaining this equipment, and other areas will open up. You'll have labor that can work in its newest, most valued use instead of an older valued use that's no longer as valuable anymore. So the economy will adjust, which it has. And it's not like no one's working in the West Coast ports or around them or in the West Coast. There are jobs here. People might not be in the old job they had.
I would encourage our friends to look at this piece on this subject written by our senior fellow, Ben Powell. It's available on our website, also on the Hill website where it was originally published. His analysis is pretty compelling. I found the history part especially interesting. You mentioned back in the 1960s, there was alarm about automation and so forth. Apparently, in the early 60s, there was a strike in 62 and 64 against automation, against containerization. And you remember George Meany, the former AFL-CIO president, he says it's becoming, this new automation is a curse on society. So to protect, the flow of goods, both Kennedy and Johnson presidents invoked the Taft-Hartley Act, and there was a cooling off. The unions accepted new work rules, which allowed, at least on the West Coast, the spread of mass containerization, which we've all benefited from. And then, in return, the remaining dock workers got some higher wages and some payoffs to displaced workers. That seemed like a pretty reasonable solution to that problem.
Well, first of all, generally libertarians don't like the Taft-Hartley Act, but they also don't like the Wagner Act. So the Wagner Act artificially fosters unions and protects them in various ways. And then the Taft-Hartley Act takes back some of that. So it's just better to have voluntary relations between all the parties. This is not only in the time of containerization. Think of the Luddites. I mean, this is a famous incident in English history where weavers were smashing more advanced, more automated equipment. And because they said, steam-driven loom as opposed to a hand loom or whatever it was, we're going to break it because it's, quote unquote, taking our job, but it's really adjusting the jobs to fit with the expanding efficiency of equipment.
Right. In the long run, everybody's better off by these kinds of technological adjustments.
In the short run, some people aren't. And
That's
some
right.
people have political pressure they can bring to bear.
Yeah, that's understandable. So we're talking about technology and automation and so forth. This makes me think about our newest version of the same issue elsewhere in high-tech AI, artificial intelligence. So,
Right.
I mean, I don't understand all the depths of that, but one thing
It's
did
going to
catch.
abolish intellectuals.
Oh, great.
Policy intellectuals, you just push a button and it summarizes all that
That's
everybody has ever thought on the issue. And we
They'll
can
probably
just,
take all of our recordings and just like
Right,
process us.
if I played golf, it would be something I would.
But the one thing that did catch my attention, especially in this AI domain, is the fact that both California and Minnesota
Right.
have passed legislation concerning deepfakes that have a political character. And I think it's fascinating that those two states happen to be the two states where the ticket leaders for the Democratic Party in the 2024 election have held leadership positions and do in both California and Minnesota. So these
Right.
two states have passed these laws forbidding deepfakes that are deemed political.
Well, part of the progressive ethos going back to the 1890s is that we experts, we governmentally installed managers know better how to manage the chaos that's out there than decentralized, spontaneous orders, people working in the marketplace, volunteers, whatever. So we have things like fact-checking. Admittedly, it's not that good, but we have competing fact-checking. So if you can look at Newsbusters, for example, will have one view, and PolitiFact will have another view, and you can triangulate between those to help yourself get the facts. And the problem in the specifics here is that you could have, we've been working up to this. It's not like people haven't put out pictures where they've imposed somebody's head.
Oh, of course they have. They've always done that.
Are they?
They're just more convincing looking.
It's more convincing looking. And mimics could do things that were either funny or horrifying, but who it was happening to. So that's now taken up another technological notch. I think it's probably going to be found unconstitutional because it's interfering with free speech. And in this political area, which is a deeply, there's disputes about free speech. Does slandering your wife constitute free speech? Whatever it is. Pornography. But this political speech is indisputably free speech as far as all people in
and indisputably protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution.
Yes. And so here, if you're not entitled to have people tell the truth about you in a complete sense. I mean, this is a kind of complicated area because of libel and slander law.
Yeah, if you're a public figure, though, I mean, you're pretty much out there.
Yeah, you're pretty much in deep trouble. So what's happening here is that they say, "Oh, this is disinformation. This is hate speech. This is interference with election." Blah blah blah. But they're really talking about their opponents. They are doing it in some other subtly different way, and it's also a thing where humor and caricature and I mean, is Saturday Night Live a deep fake?
Yeah, exactly.
I saw recently on Gutfeld, they had two people imitating Harris and Trump. They said, well, they won't debate anymore, so we've brought them in, and they had two people. They did a really good job, Surprise, surprise, Harris comes from a middle-class family.
We've heard that a lot.
I thought it was quite funny. Anyway, The point isn't that a kind of a deep fake? So there's going to be litigation here, and some sensible liberals and some sensible conservatives can also be part of this. Even though these two states are progressive states, you have plenty of conservatives who think, this is just frightening, and we have to the government has to control it. We politicians and bureaucrats have to control
exactly.
it.
Yeah, it's terrible. Apparently in Minnesota, there's a lawsuit against the state for the law by two content creators who make their living, at least one of them makes their living, on the creation and dissemination of such things, oftentimes explicitly labeled parody.
Right.
And they rightly are pointing out that the definitions are so overbroad that they could just
be...
So
one of the aspects of Supreme Court interpretation is, let's say you have some seemingly legitimate public purpose, which would be, in this case, election integrity or something like that. Okay, so then you craft a law or rule pertaining to this. How broad is it? How encompassing is it? Could it have been more narrowly tailored to address the specific problem?
Right.
And I think the people that are critics of these statutes say they just use vague language. They just cast a net that takes in many, many people and many, many things that have been going on since as long as history has been recorded, in terms of, people criticizing each other or mocking each other or caricaturing or mimicking or whatever.
The lawsuit in Minnesota apparently says, among other things, the state has no significant legitimate interest in acting as a ministry of truth. Which I thought was a nice summary.
Right. The critics are taking, so Ministry of Truth, of course, is a reference to George Orwell's 1984, where the protagonist works in the Ministry of Truth, which does nothing but distort history, erase history, just mold history completely. So,
and I get why people don't like these deepfakes. I think some of them are scurrilous, but as is typically the case, the solution is worse than the problem. You create these.
The solution is extensive government intrusive regulation, and the real solution is so commonly stated, it's a cliche, is more speech. In other words, it's hard for the truth to catch the lie sometimes, but if it's of significant interest to people will also come across or seek out the truth or
I would have thought that in the aftermath of the COVID lockdowns and so forth, that the public in general would be more sensitized to the dangers of having government agencies restrict or control or censor or whatever, because so much of that turned out to be false and damaging during the COVID lockdown. And I think that may be true, but maybe in California and Minnesota, there's still a public appetite for more government control of speech.
It's not clear that Californians or Minnesotans took that lesson from the lockdown. Many people are dissatisfied with the lockdowns, but some of them are dissatisfied that they weren't earlier and harder. So there are cultural differences. During the lockdown, let's say we're 2020, 2021. If you were in Orange County, California, you had a very latitudinarian approach to it. If you were in Palo Alto, everything was locked down. Everybody, if you were in the middle of a park, you better have a mask on. So, I don't know. We think of these things, we think of Watergate or the catastrophic war in Vietnam, and we think, well, people take a lesson from this, that people going on adventures overseas it can be counterproductive, or Watergate, well, all this power, scramble for it, maybe we should step back a little bit and giving all this power to the president. Hey, have we gone on overseas wars since then? Have we added more power to the presidency? People they sort of take lessons, but not maybe taken.
I am hopeful, though, that in this case, with the AI deepfakes and free speech generally, that people are more likely than not to get the point. And of course, the courts are especially likely that free speech in general is the best solution to bad speech.
Well, one thing that is helpful here is that there can be a coalition of people like some conservatives who are libertarians who are skeptical of big government. But there's also people in the news media and in culture and in the arts and so forth that also aren't really looking for a bureaucrat telling them what to do.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of potential, they don't have to actually be collaborating, but if they're each pointing out the problems from their own perspective, that can be politically put.
Yeah. Artistic freedom is popular. Free speech, should be popular. They're all about the same kind of thing. And I found it worse.
The lower, we have this data now from college students and professors about what the kind of things they would like to suppress. It's frightening.
It's stunning.
And what they want, students say, well, if my professor uses the wrong pronoun, I should report him immediately to the school authorities. If my professor says X, Y, or Z about Palestine or about Israel, I should report him. It's, abortion and all these so-called triggering issues. They want to turn in their teaching assistant or their professor or their fellow student. They don't lynch them. It's more mob pressure than lynch.
Right.
But it's
well,
not
I found
good.
it very alarming that so august a public person as John Kerry, when he spoke to the recent World Economic Forum, he said that the First Amendment's free speech protection is a major block against spreading disinformation. And so John Kerry himself is expressing skepticism about the First Amendment, echoing other sort of famous people like Prince Harry of England. Apparently he said that the First Amendment is bunk or something like that.
Yeah.
And so the reason for all this, though, is because people use their speech poorly. Abusive things are said, false things are said. I understand,
I also think, though, I don't want to be pushing this too far, but we've had a situation in the past. So think back to our youth, where we had people like Walter Cronkite, 3 main broadcasting networks, a few newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Christian Science Monitor, the LA Times. They kind of set the plate for news and opinion in the United States.
Oh, I'm too young to remember that, Bill.
Oh, you're not. Anyway, the point is that now it's diversified a lot. There's lots of different sources. And the people that used to have this privilege of setting the table, they're resentful of it. And so they lash out and they think, well, people like us should be giving guidance and instruction to people on what to believe. And your point would be, well, didn't people learn from the COVID lockdowns that sometimes the experts and the authorities go beyond the evidence, seek control at any opportunity, and so forth? I think, yes, people do say vile things. Yes, people are mean. They get excited. Part of this might be, classical liberal would say, well, reduce the stakes, make the government less powerful so people don't fight last knife lunch.
Fighting over power is always difficult.
Right.
If there's no power to fight over, then you don't have as much to fight over.
Exactly. But we will still always have emotions, and some emotions are triggered by things, perceived threats that may not be truly threats. But the point is, we're going to always have to be dealing in this area.
Yeah, I don't want to minimize things, though. Like, for example, there really is such a thing as hate, and it's despicable and damaging. But laws against hate speech
Actually, hate speech is constitutional.
Right, that's the
in
trouble.
the United States. It's not
and
the
it's and I'm
trouble.
glad
That's
it's on.
a good thing, because government monitors are not
Right.
going to do it right.
Right.
And we have a better chance in civil society to combat ill-tempered speech,
Right.
falsehoods, by pushing the truth, by pushing
Right.
a more civil discussion. And it's not going to be perfect. Humans are just not perfect, but we have a better shot at a good society if
Exactly. It's not that we
don't rely
care.
on bureaucratic guidance.
Mm-hmm. It's not that we don't care about hateful things that people say. We do care. We just don't think that empowering governmental monitoring and coercion and penalties and imprisonment is going to be the good solution. Other countries have a less of a barrier against those silly laws than we do.
Right. So there are European and Australian laws in these areas that are, I mean, the United States, we have many problems, but in one sense, the Constitution has served us well when it comes to civil liberties.
But I mean, the Canadians, for example, there's a bill C-63. I'm reading from an interesting Substack by Andrew Doyle. Bill C-63 is a law that would give judges the ability to put a citizen under house arrest if they thought they might commit a hate crime because of hate speech. And then there's the Scottish government, which has drafted a hate speech bill in which those get found guilty of insulting behavior could be imprisoned for 7 years. And it turns out that under the Scottish legislation, what's classified as hateful is based solely on the perception of the quote-unquote victim. And of course, French law now prohibits and punishes people for public insults based on race, religion, national origin. And in Finland, agitation against a minority group is a crime, a hate crime of some kind. And there was that notable Finnish politician, Päivi Räsänen, who was prosecuted for posting a Bible verse, which was construed to somehow be against
this. This is a not crazy worry of many Americans who take their religious views seriously. That I mean, it's a complicated problem, because the virtue of tolerance is fading in America right now. I'm not saying it ever was in an ideal situation, but the task of people who are serious about religion or serious about their way of life is to figure out how they can both uphold it and teach their children and give guidance to their friends and so forth, without getting caught up in fighting with people, and trying to impose on people and dominate, and let people adhere to what best suits their life, and have a society in which we're not murdering each other over religion.
Right. I mean, we're in big trouble, though, if somehow the laws are going to be created or construed such that believing in the Bible, for example, or teaching your kids the Bible is somehow a hate crime. The book that's been at the center of Western civilization for 2,000 years is suddenly a hate crime? We can't allow that to happen, and the First Amendment doesn't, in fact, allow it to happen.
I agree. I'm not saying the ancient Israelites did everything right, but
Indeed. Indeed.
So where are the Amalekites, let's say? But anyway.
Well, I gave the span I just gave was not encompassing the Amalekites.
Anyway, so the point is, people should respect each other's point of view.
Yes, exactly.
And not try to forcibly dominate.
And not resort to government power to punish their neighbors whom they disagree with. That's basically what it comes down to. So, changing the subject one more time, Bill, let's talk about American colleges and universities. And again, California is sort of at the head of the pack of error. In this case, California has passed a new law enacted, signed by the governor, that forbids legacy admission at even private colleges and universities in the state of California. Basically, this is a response to court rulings against racial preferences. And so they're saying, no racial preferences, no problem. We'll just ban legacy admissions. And that will eliminate some of the skewing in favor of traditional, whatever, white family applicants.
So, first of all, I mean, if you go on a college campus today, there's every kind of different looking person there. It's not like a monochromatic.
It's not homogeneous.
That's right. So, and by the way, they're not saying racial preferences. Oh, we accept that. No, they're not saying that.
They're fighting that too.
They want to go back, but they want to figure out how they can have people write little admissions application essays that tell everything about their race, and so they're trying to evade the idea that applicants should be treated on their own terms and own merits. That here's the thing. If you have a government-provided school, government-provided college or university, it's troubling to voters, to citizenry, to say, well, we're not going to admit people on merit. We're going to pick the alumni's children.
Right.
So
yeah, that is annoying.
And you might even claim, this is stretching it, but getting into sort of the idea that is we have a thing in our Constitution and in our background that we don't create classes of nobility. So in a sense, you're having a hereditary caste that's going into these.
It also would violate equal protection if it's a state institution.
Right. And the thing also to remember is the average taxpayer is not going to college.
Right.
And is subsidizing people that are going to be rich in later life.
Right.
So I can see that a public university, say University of California, California State Universities, different campuses, and this has been illegal for quite a while, California.
On the state institutions.
Right, on the state institutions. So let's take private universities. Stanford, University of Southern California, Santa Clara University, Occidental, Pomona, Claremont McKenna, and so forth. I'm picking pretty well-known selected ones. But the point is, shouldn't they be able to decide who can go inside the boundary of their campus? This is putting it in classical liberal terms of kind of property. Who and under what conditions? Yeah, so there's a football game. We're going to let everybody in who has a ticket to the football game. We have a library. Okay, you have a card, or you might be a student, professor, or researcher, or you might be some outside person that can buy permission or get granted reciprocally somebody from another university. Normally, they can decide who uses the facilities. So who would go in and take the classes, who would get credit. So they would be able to decide. And they could have a mix of people who are there for academic reasons. Maybe they want to have a university symphony orchestra, so they need an oboist. So they, the oboist might not have as good grades as some chemists that they might also be looking at, but they want the oboist, and they got plenty of chemists, just hypothetical. So they do this in the admissions, and they create an interesting mix. And some people would even say they might want legacy people, not only for their donations, because tuition doesn't cover everything at a private school, so they have an endowment, so gathered pool of investment that they get revenue from. But also they want just continuing donations, not just the money from a previous donation. that's been now invested. And they need that. So they want to establish that kind of sense of loyalty, and that they want to draw on it. But they also want to, let's say, hypothetically, there's a Stanford type or an SC type. Some people might be wanting to go to college because they want to be that type of person. I mean, we know in K-12 education, some people send their children to progressive preschools because they want their kids to be kind of hippie, bohemian type people. And I don't, and so that can be also true. You want to go to Berkeley because you want to hang out on Telegraph Avenue. So anyway, it could be a case that if you have legacies, you can continue that type more easily. So these are some of the reasons why they might want to do this. I think, the argument on so Richard Vedder, who works with Independent Institute, and has for a long time. We published many of his books.
One of our senior fellows.
Yes, exactly. So he's an expert in I'm knowledgeable about higher education, but compared to him, he knows much. So anyway, he has written on this, and he wrote a very fun column in which he stated both sides, But one of his main points, he makes the same kinds of points I do in terms of why private schools might want to do this. But he also says, well, how private are they? Maybe they're really not that different from Cal State University or University of California, because they get a ton of government money. They have agricultural programs at UC Davis that are run by the state. Well, also they have military programs or energy department programs at Stanford that are funded or the medical programs at Stanford Hospital and Stanford Medical School are paid for, a lot of it, by the federal government. So if you take Stanford as an example and you look at, okay, well, what are all the sources of revenue? You'll notice when they draw their little pie charts of this, they have a big asterisk, and they say SLAC, which is the energy department, linear accelerator, and medical school, we're not including that. If they did, it would show that a majority of annual funds for Stanford come from government. So Vedder says, well, if we're not going to allow legacies at state universities and colleges, really these private universities are government colleges, and we shouldn't allow it there either. I don't really want to go that far, because it's similar to the highways, the aid to the highways in the face of the disaster. If we give up all public-private distinctions and say everything's public, not only do we lose all rights, but we're losing a place to fight back. So the real solution is to try to re-privatize the private colleges and universities, get them less dependent on the government, get them to maybe spin off their government-funded aspects and whatever. Stanford did this, by the way. It used to have a thing called Stanford Research Institute that was almost completely government-funded, that would do applied projects. And it got too controversial, partly during the Vietnam War, but in general, the Stanford faculty did not really like this that much. And so they spun it off. The Center for Strategic and International Studies at Johns Hopkins, they spun it off, same way. So this can happen. But all I'm saying is, I think the private colleges and universities should be able to decide their admissions. And at the same time, the less they are kind of kept prostitutes of the government, the better.
Well, it's funny about this issue of legacy admissions. It kind of cuts both ways on some of the usual political scales. So, for example, there was this piece in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week by Jason Riley, in which
who's a conservative.
Yeah, and he was essentially, he literally said it, conservatives will probably like what Governor Newsom in California has just signed into law by banning legacy admission on private colleges, because supposedly these days conservatives are in favor of meritocracy instead of racial preferences. And so therefore they should like this new action, this new exercise of state power. They should like it because it's on the basis of meritocracy, supposedly.
Well, I'm sympathetic to this argument. Obviously, it fits in with things that you and I have discussed in the past here. But I always try to slip in liberal meritocracy or one thing or another, because we really believe in a liberal society, a free society, in which you could have a company and you could promote your brother or your son or your daughter or your sister
that shouldn't
into
be
a
illegal.
Position of trust and responsibility, even if on some kind of test-making grounds they weren't as qualified.
Right.
You might want to keep up the esprit of the company as a family company. You might want to have them watching the cash register because things.
And besides, it's just your company.
It's your company. Okay, so also let's do a kind of reductio. Let's push out this idea of meritocracy. Aren't we in danger of having a Platonic philosopher kings type society where, and some people would argue that's a distortion we're suffering from right now, where the only dimension on which people are in power is because they passed some test or they, had some technical qualification.
Right.
And therefore they're entitled to tell the rest of us what to do.
Right. That's not a humane society.
I don't think so. And I don't think it's danger to have either authoritarianism or totalitarianism, because if you say, oh, you're really smart, you can tell everybody else what to do, then you've lost freedom. So I think you have to say meritocracy as appropriate in a free society.
Right.
And so I think a university's reputation is built on a combination of things, but one of the main things is the scholarship.
Right.
And the selectivity of admissions. So a wise university or college is not going to, bring in only legacy admissions.
That's right. Certainly not.
Maybe only star athletes would work. I don't know.
Right.
But the point is they're going to have a mixture of this. And it's part of their entrepreneurial decision as to exactly what the mix is.
I get why.
And even in the department, academic department, you can have some people who are great researchers but not very good teachers, and some people who are teachers but not very good researchers. They're going to resent each other. Okay, there's going to be conflict, but that can be a balance that you have.
I get the argument that governmentally controlled institutions have to abide by the equal protection principle and so forth. But I think, as you're pointing out, there has to be a non-governmental realm in society, and it has to have private property protections, among other things. So, for example...
this is attacking that.
Yeah, it is. And I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't lawsuits. I mean...
I think there will be.
Yeah, because I was checking in the California Constitution, not to mention the federal, but California Constitution has its own provisions in Section 7 and Section 19 protecting private property, which can't be taken for public use without just compensation. And arguably... a university, it's a taking. Yeah, if you control a business.
Certainly Richard Epstein, who's written a great book on this many years ago, would argue that this is a taking.
So stand by for news on this subject. Let's close with the final subject, Bill.
Okay.
Bill Evers, he's a polymath of liberty, as I said at the beginning, and he pointed out to me earlier that there are some interesting little bright lights, glimmers of light in really bad places like Gaza and Lebanon, where in the midst of the tragedy, people are doing some effective things. Can you give us some details?
Yeah, so I think, Graham and I are not experts on weaponry or on-the-ground guerrilla warfare or how to blow up your enemy's munitions dump. But we are very interested in, we're interested in how to prevent war, end war, but we're also interested in what people do under emergency conditions, how civil society and the market respond. And we were talking earlier about Florida and all this. So in Lebanon, the government has been gradually atrophying. They have a complicated ethnic makeup. The boundaries of Lebanon were drawn by France in order to try to have a majority Catholic. But the Catholics have not kept up with the non-Catholics in terms of having children. So, like, it's a horrifying thing to have a census in Lebanon these days. But anyway, so they assigned a Maronite Christian would be, which is a kind of a Catholic with a separate religious right, would be the president. And the prime minister would be a Sunni, and the speaker of the parliament would be a Shiite, and so forth. They do. I might not have this exactly right, but they have, and then they have the Druze, and then they have lots of other Alawites and a lot of other.
It's so complex that it's broken down.
13 major religions in
right.
Lebanon.
Well, it's so complicated, it's not really governing.
Right. So for a number of reasons, this has been breaking down. I mean, if you remember, in 1958, Eisenhower sent troops in there. That was kind of symptomatic of the situation, and it's been going downhill since. So anyway, the Israelis and the Hezbollah, which is a Shiite militia funded by Iran, have been battling it out since October 7th. They were battling it out before that. But, and Hezbollah was originally kind of a aid charitable group kind of thing, somewhat self-protection that grew up Israeli incursions and occupations of 20 years ago. The Shiites were kind of the bottom of the totem pole in Lebanon, and so they kind of felt to take over their mission was also to drive the Israelis out of Lebanon.
But I think that where you're going is that these things have all been falling apart, but in spite of it, there's a resurgence of activity to help and protect.
So the government, there's been no president in Lebanon for 2 years, just to give you some idea of how fascinating this country is. Their central bank head has been found to have been engaged in billions of dollars of embezzlement. They had a store of explosives blow up in their main port that knocked out blocks. So the government the army can't cope with Israel invading the way it is now. And the government is attenuating, disappearing, withering away, however you want to think of it. So in response, and this is what the article says it's distinctive, all these self-help, neighborhood, charitable things. So they mention that they're one of the groups, it's a rival Shiite group to Hezbollah, is a group called Amal. Well, they have schools. So the schools are right now centers for giving out emergency aid, people coming to sleep there if their house has been blown down, or they had to migrate to the north. All this self-help is substituting for the government. And one of the people that was interviewed in the story said, well, the government has vanished. We don't really even have a government. Once the fighting is over, then the government will come back. It was kind of a charming,
that was
sardonic view of what is the reality.
And the New York Times article also says, into the void left by the state have stepped private donors, individual volunteers, citizen aid groups, entrepreneurs, and social services organizations. Amazing.
Right. So a somewhat similar thing is happening in Gaza. So Gaza is under much more intense attack than Lebanon. Of course, the Lebanon war is just beginning, so it might get worse and worse and worse. They had some pictures in the New York Times, villages leveled by fighting and so forth. But anyway, Gaza is really leveled. And so under earlier circumstances, food aid, in other words, groceries would come in from the United Nations and they would distribute it. And of course, Hamas in reality controlled the ground level operations of this UN aid. Actually, we found out that some UN employees were involved in the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th. It was a huge scandal. But anyway, so the UN was in there, and they used to deliver, say, 95% of the food aid in the area. They have stepped back. They their employees say, well, it's too dangerous. We're not going to work today. And so in response, private entrepreneurs are selling food. They get screened by the Israelis, and they bring in food from outside. Some could be from the West Bank, could be from Israel.
Apparently, 2/3 of it is from Israel itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Coming in to feed the Gazans
by
private traders.
Exactly. Now, the other thing is, of course, it's not only is it very dangerous because Israeli drones or whatever observation or surveillance, they are looking for any organized person moving around, and then zap, they're going to kill them. So these traders who are trying to move things, they could easily be mistaken for Hezbollah operatives. So they are under a very difficult situation. And of course, everything is scarce. And so prices are going to go up. So just as we were talking about Florida and prices going up, people are complaining, well, prices are going up. Well, excuse me, it's a war. A war is going on, and things are scarce. Premium that you have to be paying for people taking big risks. Then there's the danger that things will be stolen. People will hijack your food that you're bringing in. They will try and seize any stored food.
But in spite of that, apparently, the flow of private aid
but for the private enterprise, it's amazing because they would have all starved to death if this wasn't going on.
The private share has gone up from 5% in April to 60% in August.
Right, and that probably undercounts it. The people, of course, saying, well, it costs too much, and since it's dangerous, they have to have armed guards. They have to have mercenaries.
Which is tragic.
Well, I mean, people protect things that are valuable. And so, but the UN people say, oh, horror of horrors, not only these people are making a profit, but they carry guns. And we would never carry. So, when it's dangerous, people will carry guns.
Yeah.
Right to bear arms.
I mean,
so anyway,
the bottom line is, even under duress, human creativity can find a way if it's not suppressed entirely by force.
Exactly.
Finds a way. It's amazing.
It is both of these stories in the midst of horror, in the midst of really the most gruesome situation for human beings. It's amazing what human ingenuity people have in trying to survive to the extent they can flourish.
Exactly.
And the market is a way of serving other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, you can serve them by donating, but you can also serve them by selling them.
Thank you for your insight, Bill. I always appreciate it. I'm grateful to everybody who joins us for these conversations. And of course, I invite you, as always, to visit our website, independent.org, where we have a whole raft of informed commentary and information that can help you sort things out. We put it up there every day from our scholars and researchers. Thank you for joining us on Independent Outlook. See you next time. Bye-bye.